Hello, my name is Alison Steele, and I'm the mother of 19-year-old murder victim Kaylee Mandati. After my daughter was murdered in late 2017, I decided that I wanted to honor her as best I could by pursuing some key legislative changes that would help prevent the needless deaths of people like her in similar situations. However, what I found at the time when I started the process is that there's very few good resources available for citizen advocates such as myself and others like me. We typically have real jobs that, we can't devote full time to this effort. And so we need to do the best we can with what we have, which isn't very much. And so after I got done with the 2019 legislative session in Texas, I decided I would make a couple of very simple training videos and offer them to other people who are thinking about doing this kind of work. If you've landed on this YouTube page, then you are actually on the second in the series of training seminars that I've put together. The first one had the good fortune to be hosted by a wonderful organization called Crime Stoppers of Houston, which provides victim advocacy services, education, public outreach, all of those services that are absent from a large number of other areas of the country. But I got lucky, I guess, because I'm a proud Houstonian and we have those resources here. So if you stumbled again on this video, I highly encourage you to go ahead and watch that one first because there's really two facets to doing this kind of work, especially if you are a crime victim. You have to manage all of the demands of the legislative advocacy itself, but you also have to cope with your grief and that whole process as a crime victim. And so that first seminar is really dealing with that. It's more of a personal exploration. And of course, it's much more fun to be in front of a live audience, more dynamic. And this presentation is not. This is a homemade YouTube. We're doing the best we can here, but we'll try to get through it anyway. So again, watch that one first, and that will give you the lead in to what we're going to go through right now. Why am I doing this? Well, as I said, I wanted to do something in memory of my daughter. The years I had with her were way beyond anything I could have imagined. I got so lucky as a mom, and anything that I can do in her memory to make this world a better place is something that appeals to me very greatly. So that was my primary motivation, but not the only one. I also want to pay it forward because so many people helped me. When I couldn't find the resources I needed, I just kind of went, help. Somebody, can you help me? Can someone, point me in the right direction on this or that? And a tremendous number of people stepped up for me, and I want to help other people as I'm able to do it with my other life responsibilities. I do encourage you to contact me if you've seen the first film, if you like this film. If I can do anything for you, discuss your case after you've watched these two films. I'd love to sit down with you or talk to you on the phone, depending on where you are in the country. Because advocacy resources are very few and far between. When I went on the internet initially, I was like, okay, I've never been to the legislature before. Let's just, start at the beginning and start, Google is often the beginning, search engine. Let's just see what I can find. And I was really shocked because almost everything out there had a very strong political motive, or it was geared to a different type of interaction with the legislature and the legislative process. And I'm going to get to a complete explanation of what I mean by that. And so resources like this right here, what I'm trying to do, which is to give you the straight information without, getting you looped into one, political objective or another. This stuff is rare, and feel free to drop me a line if you think otherwise, but that's my experience. I am, even though my legislation did pass the 2019 legislature, and we went back in 2021 again to do the naming of our bill. It was a separate legislative process. So I've been twice through the entire process. Even though my work is done, I am interested in working with other catalyst cases in particular, and those are high-profile crime events, crime victims, who I feel are often not treated as they should be. And this is the farther I go down, the rabbit hole on this process, the more I see exactly that. People don't know how to handle us, murder survivors in particular, especially if it's a high profile event. Then there's going to be a lot of attention focused on the family, the friends, the survivors. People don't know how to behave around us. We talked about that in the first slide, the first presentation rather. And as a result, sometimes, they wear kid gloves because they're afraid of offending, and now we have this whole cultural thing going on in America where everybody's offended at the drop of a hat. And, I'm not going to be overly careful in dealing with other crime victims and other murder survivors because I find that to be a patronizing attitude. I realize people do it innocently, but it's not helping those people. So if you choose to contact me, or even as you're listening to these presentations, you're going to find out I'm going to give it to you the way I see it. You may not like it. It may not be what other people have told you, but I'm not here to, to smooth out any feathers. I'm here to give you some information that might be valuable to you. Okay, life is a 3-act play, and so is this presentation. So let me just run down a list here of different things that we're going to talk about. First of all, though, let me say there are many, many words on these slides, and that is intentional on my part. There is a tremendous amount that you need to know whether you're going through the legislative process in Texas or, it's equally true wherever your state is, they're going to have a similar process to what I'm describing here. And so all these general rules are going to be similar. And it's intentional. What I'm doing here is intentional. Number one, so that you can go back over it and look at the different ways that I've presented information. I myself am a visual learner. I like to see things, words, pictures, all of that. Other people are different. They are, auditory. They like to hear things, and that's how they get it into their brains. So I've tried to cover a lot of different bases just with this format, but the same thing, regardless of what type of learner you are, the same thing is true either way. And that is that as you repeat material, it stays in your mind better. And there's no better example of that phenomenon than the old children's, I say old because it's been around for a couple of decades now, the old children's television program called Blue's Clues. And Blue's Clues was the first of its type to do something radical. They would air the same episode on the television for children 5 days in a row, 5 days a week. And that's the same way that children like to read books over and over again, because that's how they cement that information in their minds. And my daughter Kaylee was an enormous fan of Blue's Clues. So I have memories, vivid memories of, being there in the room and listening to that same thing over and over again. And that's how it works for children, and children know that instinctively. That's why they seek it out. But guess what? Same approach works for adults. Adults just tend not to use it as much. So that's why I'm doing what I'm doing here. Again, rate of forgetting with study repetition. Studies have been well done on this. If you don't repeat it, you will forget it. Okay, so if you don't repeat it, you will forget it. If you don't repeat it, you'll forget it. If you don't repeat it, you'll forget. I'm sorry, that's annoying. Anyway, now on to the 3-act play. I'm trying to do this in one take, so I apologize for the amateur approach here. Something went wrong. Is legislation the best way to fix it? That is the number one question that we have to ask when we are assessing this from a purely logistical headspace. Remember, in the first videos, what I did was I looked at it from a personal, kind of a more heartfelt perspective, but now we're down to brass tacks. And we have to ask ourselves right at the outset of any given process is like, okay, something needs to happen or something went wrong, but is legislation the way to go? And so I'm going to walk you through that. Is it right for you personally? Most of that I covered in the first video, but there's some additional considerations I'm going to throw in now. If the answer is yes to both of those questions, then there's the question of who leads, you or someone else. That's the Act 1 in our 3-act play of this presentation. Next, we're going to move on to the idea of research. What if you have a legislative idea? How do you research that? How do you find out what the precedents were? How do you find out what's been done before? There's very systematic ways to go about that, and there's tools that I'm going to show you how to use for that. How to approach legislators. This is a big, hairy deal for some people because they're like, well, gee, what do I say? You know, how do I have an idea. I kind of looked into it, but how do I go to that, you know, person who is my legislator and even raise the topic? How do you do that? Okay, let's say you do it and, you know, you're successful. Your legislator, whichever one you've contacted, decides this is an idea, this has wheels, let's give it a try, and let's file a bill. So that's Act 2 of the 3-act play. That's another chunk. And again, this is a lot of information, and what I'm trying to do is break it down into individual pieces and 3 acts so that you can hit pause when you need to take a break. Okay, so you've got a bill. That means you're going to be going through committee. How do you do that? What does that mean, go through committee? How do you prepare for it? Usually in Texas and probably in other states, bills move from the House of Representatives to the Senate to the governor. Sometimes it moves through the Senate first, but what I just described is the more common pathway. So we'll talk about how that happens and the importance of the House committee hearing. Calendars. Calendars is kind of a little known legislative stage where the bill actually gets assigned to come up for a vote. Then it does go through the vote, usually in the House first, but sometimes in the Senate. Then it goes through the Senate process once it's cleared the House, and finally to the governor. So those mechanics are kind of going to be what I'm calling our Act 3 in this process. And then I will close by just recapping, lessons learned and summarizing everything that I've presented. Okay, again, I said this in the first video. My purpose is to help people to prepare. In my experience, most of the time, people are perfectly capable of carrying their own bills if they decide to do this, and they're certainly, if you got this far, if you're at the point where you're watching this video, you're motivated. So you're already on board. If there is a deficit, if there is a problem that people have, it's usually with preparation. And so legislative work is, again, it's massively front end loaded on preparation. And the analogy here on the slide is, the paint job. This is a very common observation. Most of you have probably heard it before. A good paint job is 90% preparation and 10% execution. My daughter's favorite book, and mine too, was called Harold and the Purple Crayon. We read it at least 100 times, similar to the way she watched Blue's Clues. And if you look at that book, Harold spent 54 pages preparing and 6 pages executing. And, just to make things a little less dry, I'm going to pull a few quotes from Harold through this presentation because I absolutely love that book. And I sure miss reading it with her. Those were good days. So, to summarize, many people can teach you purely mechanical things about the legislature. But if you take on a role as a citizen advocate, you need to prepare. And far fewer people can teach you how to do that, I feel. At least that's my experience. Okay, so we're going to move now into Act 1, which I call analysis. So in the story of Harold and the Purple Crayon, Harold is out and he suddenly finds himself a little bit unmoored. He realizes that he has a job to accomplish, and that is getting himself tucked in his bed. But he doesn't remember where his bed is, and he realizes that he's got to figure it out and get there. So on this page of the book, it reads, So he left the path for a shortcut across the field, and the moon went with him. The moon is a constant symbol in Harold and the Purple Crayon. So that's what we're doing right now. We're striking out in a direction, right? We're just like, we're not sure we're going to go with this analysis, but let's head and see where we get. Okay, back to the central first question. Could positive change be legislated? I'm using the word clarity here, the 3 words clarity, humility, and courage from the first slide series. This is an issue of clarity because you can't assume that the answer is yes. Everybody says something needs to be done when stuff goes wrong, right? Somebody needs to do something. That's the common thing, the violent crime or whatever. But would a new law make a difference? Or would something else make a difference? Even if it does make a difference, should you do it? These are all questions that are central to your forward path. So what I want to do, I am a science and technology nerd, and so I tend to step through analyses very, very rigorously and, methodically. So you're going to see that right now because I'm going to take you step by step through this type of analysis, and you will have your own method, but keep this thought process in mind as you go about analyzing your own situation. Okay, so here we are, starting at the beginning. You've become a crime victim. The very first thing you have to do is identify what is the failure path. And by that I mean you have to look at it in specific terms. Sometimes someone is tragically murdered, and if you ask the survivors, well, what went wrong? They'll say things like, well, what went wrong is that, people are able to buy guns in America. That's kind of far more general than what I'm suggesting here. What I'm suggesting is look at the actual mechanics of the situation. In the case of my daughter, we didn't have in Texas an emergency broadcast alert on the books that was part of our law that could have been called to potentially save her life, or to help at least give her a chance. So that was the failure point, that I identified specifically as the weak spot in the whole chain. After you have determined that exact failure path, you have to take a look at what is your top priority in the situation. And this is not a cursory, simple analysis that you need to make here, because it could be that once you've looked at the totality of your situation, you might decide that you need to concentrate on your family, or, concentrate on your spiritual path or whatever. If I had had other children at the point where my daughter was murdered, my very first responsibility would have been to them. And as much as I might have wanted to pursue legislation, I might not have been able to if I had to spend my time, meeting their needs first. It would have been a balancing act and something I would have had to think about very carefully. So you can't minimize that. That's important. Maybe what we need in response to whatever went wrong, though, is actually social change rather than something personal. Maybe there's some bigger picture that needs to be accounted for. And if that is the case, then you have to ask yourself, well, at what level? Where am I going to make social change? Because we have a big, complicated society. Maybe you could work with an existing nonprofit organization on whatever that issue is. Gosh knows there's enough of them out there. There's one for pretty much every topic. Maybe you could contribute to them. Or maybe you could build something in a new area. It all depends on your situation. Or maybe it is a situation that you have that lends itself best to legislative change, and that's what you want to pursue. Even with that, the question then becomes where? Where is the gap in the law that allowed your situation to happen the way it shouldn't have happened? It could be at the local level, it could be at the state level, or it could be at the federal level. And guess what? Right after I made this slide, I actually started lending a helping hand to an advocate who's working on issues at an international level and in interstate level. So there's that aspect as well. But this presentation is actually focused on the state level legislation. And although many of the principles, of course, are going to be common to different jurisdictions. Let's say that a solution could be legislated. Next logical question, who leads? Back to my favorite quote here on leadership. You? Are you going to be the one? Or is a special interest going to be the leader and you're going to work with them? This is a very, very central question here that needs to be answered. So let's walk through 1 and 2 and see, what are the considerations for both. All right, you and your supporters. Again, I'm sorry I'm repeating myself, but I highly encourage you to look at the first presentation, review those 5 personal factors that I talked about that you need to be clear on before you take something like this on. And now I'm going to get some hate mail on this next part, I know this. It also helps to consider your own personality profile. In that first video, I talked about the importance of having the right attitude. If you really want to get somewhere in the Texas legislature, you go in with an attitude of cooperation and collaboration, not confrontation. Because confrontation is what you see on TV, but it's not what gets a lot of this work done. Some people have a much easier time than others at the legislature, and a lot of their experience, a lot of that relates to their personality. If you go onto Google or whatever your favorite search engine is and look for this thing called the Big 5 personality traits, you can actually take these tests that are like free little, you answer the questions and it gives you feedback on your personality. And one of the ways that this Big 5 is described is by the acronym OCEAN, and the OCEAN letters stand for openness, conscientiousness, extroversion, agreeableness, and neuroticism. And you may wonder what in the heck that has to do with the legislature, but you can take the personality characteristics describe these traits and actually match them up with questions that are extremely relevant to life at the legislature, and I do that as follows. Question number 1, are you comfortable having new things thrown at you every hour of every day? When I first started participating in the legislature, my mind was blown by the intensity of it. It's really, really a rush. Again, in Texas, we have 140 days every second year, and those are our regular legislative sessions. That's not much time. A lot needs to happen. And so people are constantly running around frantically. Work is getting done really, really fast. And the barrage of new information never stops coming. Are you prepared to work your tail off? If that is the case, then guess what? The legislature will be for you. Can you approach hundreds of new people with confidence? Are you okay going up to someone and saying, hey, I got a question. Do you have a minute? I'd like to discuss something with you. Can you politely refuse to take no for an answer over and over again? You're going to meet a lot of people at your legislature that have a lot of priorities that aren't your priority. And in order to get their ear, sometimes you have to be polite, but you have to keep pushing when you're told, oh, I'm sorry, I don't have anything on my schedule. Well, can you make 5 minutes for me? That kind of thing. Can you remain unemotional, focused, and trustworthy? Can you have that attitude of humility? Be humble or you will stumble. If the answer is yes, this might be a good fit for you. So what I've described here, going down this list like this, is a person with a high degree of openness, a high degree of conscientiousness, a high degree of extroversion. Extroverts like people, like dealing with people. A low degree of agreeableness, and a low degree of neuroticism. And guess what? For better and for worse, I just described exactly how I profile when I take one of those little tests online. So my experience with the legislature and the legislative process, those are extremely positive for me. If you are an introvert, on the other hand, I may have just described, the living hell for you. And so bearing in mind these five traits, these 5 personality traits, it might be a good thing for you to do, because if you don't match up well with, these kinds of traits, maybe you want to craft a way of dealing with people and an approach that's a little different than what I'm describing here. I loved it. I mean, stuff's, coming at you from all sides. I'm a very high energy person, as you may have figured out. And so it was right up my alley, but other people are absolutely horrified by that kind of intensity. Another thing that we didn't talk about by name, because again, my first presentation was more about the feels, the personal aspects of what you're going through at the legislature. So I didn't get into definitions and delineations. I didn't want to make that presentation technical, but there are 3 different roles that citizen advocates fulfill in the legislative context. And don't be surprised if this is the first time you are hearing somebody spell this out explicitly for you, if you are a citizen advocate and you're on this learning curve, because I didn't know this until long after I needed to know it. Again, this was a clarification point that nobody made for me, and to a large degree, I didn't understand what I was seeing in the legislature, the behavior of other people, until words were attached to behaviors, and the words go like this. An advocate is someone who works in a targeted manner on behalf of an individual, a group, or an organization. That is different from an activist. An activist is someone who works to spur broader social, political change. And in the past few years, with the way our society has been evolving, we've added a 3rd category, also an A word, which is ally. That is someone who endorses a group without actually being a member of it. So advocate, activist, ally. These are 3 words you need to know. And why is that? Because it relates to behavior, and it relates to role, and behavior and role, ROLE, have a lot to do with your success in a citizen legislative effort. All 3 of those A words can engage in lobbying, even though none of them describe professional lobbyists. And again, I'm spelling this all out explicitly here. Okay, I just threw a 4th word onto the table. Lobbyist. What exactly is a lobbyist? Well, here's the definition. It's someone who makes an organized attempt to influence legislators. So that encompasses a very broad number of people, including advocates, activists, and allies. However, here's what you need to remember. This is important. This is key. I can't stress it enough. The ways in which those 3 different roles lobby are very, very different. And they are as follows. Advocates engage in work. They put their heads down, they get a job done with a specific target in mind. In my case, it was, I'm going to get this legislation passed. Activists go about it a different way. You'll notice the use of the word spurs social or political change, and it's not on a specific scale. It's on a wider scale. What an activist does is very different from an advocate, and I wish someone had explained that to me from day one. Allies can endorse either of these categories, but their role again is different. They're taking a more indirect type of supportive role. You must understand the difference. I'm telling you right now, and again, at the beginning of this, I said you may not like some of what I have to say. You have to understand the difference between activism and advocacy, because you're going to make mistakes if you don't. If you read nothing else on this topic, I recommend taking 3 minutes to go and Google this article by the U.S. Institute of Diplomacy and Human Rights from about 2 years ago, where they describe the difference very, very elegantly and succinctly. It's a very short article. And they make the point that activism is about making people listen, but advocacy is about working on identifying solutions. Both of these roles, activists and advocates, are vital parts of our democracy. We need them both. They're like right and left hands. Advocates can't do the work very often unless somebody comes before them and kicks the door open and starts the conversation. But if all you ever do is kick a door open without then engaging in the hard work and conversation, then you're not likely to be successful. So that's where I'm coming from in that one. You have to understand the difference between them. And if you want to maximize the respect that people have for you, I know I'm going to get hate mail on this next part, figure out which A word best describes you. Number one, be very clear about that. And number two, stay in your lane. Ouch, what did I just say? I know and I apologize, I'm stumbling over myself here. The different roles have different jobs. It really just comes down to that. And I can't tell you, for example, how it ruins my day when I turn on the live stream for Texas legislature to watch one of the bills that I'm following, and I see activists absolutely blowing up a committee hearing, for instance. Because a committee hearing is arguably not the place where the activist best does his or her work. That is an arena for advocates who are identifying and refining those solutions we talked about. If you decide, some people are just natural born activists. I couldn't do it if my life depended on it. I don't, I'm a disagreeable person. I don't like to be pushed around. I don't take no for an answer. I don't believe it when people, try to sell me sell me into their belief system or whatever, or convince me. But I don't have a lion's roar. I'm kind of a mouse. So activism is totally beyond me. I'm a born advocate. And so if a door needs to be opened, if the conversation hasn't yet started on a legislative issue, I'm probably not the person. But if, for example, there is legislation on the table or someone's trying to craft legislation, then yeah, I'm the worker for that job. It's just different personality types. Again, an advocate is someone who works in a targeted manner on behalf of an individual, group, or organization. I'm a born advocate. That's just the way it is. Helping to get that legislation passed is a very, very disciplined process that doesn't lend itself to the kind of disruption that can be very effective with activism. But as you notice up above here, we're still on number one on our original question, which was, who is the leader of the effort, you or somebody else? So now with that in mind, with that distinction in mind, what we're going to do is transition into the question of, What if you are an advocate, but you need help? So maybe it's not you who decides to become the leader. What does that picture look like? So that's what we're going to talk about next here. A special interest group. Guess what? It's like everything else in life. There are pros and cons to every decision that you make. There are some real strengths that special interest groups bring to the table, but there are some drawbacks as well. So let's run them down as I see them. Number one, there are a lot of established, very mature special interest groups out there that have the resources needed to bring, they can bring the resources to the table in order to get legislation passed. They have networks, they have money, they have donors, they have research, they already completed, they have lobbyists, a lot of times the paid lobbyists on staff. So obviously, I am very fond of the citizen advocate model because for a number of reasons, one of which is we need everybody at the table if we're to have a functional democracy, and citizen advocates are often underrepresented. At the same time, we don't have nearly that amount of resources, and so one of these groups may be a good fit for you. That's something you have to look at. They know the legislative process inside out, backwards, and sideways, and they're already well up that learning curve. So that's another thing that they bring to the table. They are potentially perceived as legitimizing. So if, for example, you are a catalyst case, you have a crime or situation, you decide you're going to pursue legislation, you are the example, you epitomize what the legislation is designed to accomplish, and then you link up with a good, strong, credible group, obviously that's going to be legitimizing for you. It's going to amplify your efforts, dramatically. But you have to keep this in mind too. There are also cons associated. There's potential downsides of joining forces with one of these groups. Number one, and this was a big surprise to me, is it requires a lot of lead time. A lot of these groups set their legislative agendas months or maybe even years in advance of any given legislative session. So if you show up at the door and say, well, I'm looking at, advocating for this legislation, can we get together? You may get told, well, we like you, we like what you're doing, it sounds great, but we don't have the bandwidth. I heard that exact phrase repeatedly at the legislature when I went in 2019. Love ya, love your stuff, but we simply don't have the bandwidth. We're already committed to other legislative efforts. Your initiative must fit their defined mandate. And this was a huge one for me because I was advocating for the passage of the Clear Alert, which intersects with everybody and belongs to nobody as a result, because a Clear Alert, an adult emergency broadcast alert, could be called during all different range of circumstances. The sky's kind of the limit. There could be, for example, a human trafficking kidnapping, or there could be domestic violence, or there could be a crime of opportunity such as a carjacking. One of our memorial victims was a carjacking victim. Clear Alert could be called during commission of a hate crime, gang-related violence. There's no end to it. So I didn't fit with anybody. You might forfeit creative control. In other words, and this, you'll have to forgive me for the blunt language, but you might become somebody's poster child. And maybe that's, again, blunt language, because I am a fairly disagreeable person and I tend to be blunt as a result of that. But that may be an excellent fit for you, but being a disagreeable person, it would not have been a real good fit for me, because I like to lead where I can. So I'm not sure how that would have worked out, even if the Clear Alert did fit with other mandates, or other legislative efforts by special interest groups. Don't underestimate the downside associated with politics. If you link up with a special interest, a nonprofit, or an advocacy group that has a specific political agenda and it's polarizing, in other words, it identifies strongly with one political party or the other, but not both, then you could have some baggage associated with that. You could actually, that could be as much of a downside as an upside, because these days, with politics being the way they are, you tend to lose half your audience if you get pigeonholed as like, oh, that's a political thing thereafter. So you gotta move carefully and consider things like that. Constituent-driven efforts can be perceived as more genuine. Legislators know that, individual constituents are usually not wealthy. They do have to work regular jobs in addition to whatever advocacy they're trying to do. They have responsibilities. And so legislators tend to make room for individual constituents who are not being paid to do the work and whose work is coming from the heart. That stuff is highly regarded at that kind of motivation is highly regarded at the legislature, and you may lose that if you decide instead to align yourself with a special interest group. A possible sweet spot with these pros and cons, of course, would be a scenario in which you lead, but they endorse you. So it's an informal partnership more so than a formal teaming arrangement. And that, of course, as you'll see, is exactly what I did with my effort on the Clear Alert. Okay, so that was a fair amount of information. If you're watching YouTube, now's your cue to hit pause, take a breath, and we will continue on with Act 2. Act 2 I call mobilization, and referring back to my favorite children's book, Harold and the Purple Crayon, this is the point at which Harold realizes he's not going to just strike out across a field. He actually has to pull it together and start taking specific action in order to realize his goal of reaching home and crawling into his bed for the night. So these 2 pages in the book read, "But luckily he kept his wits and his purple crayon. He made a balloon and he grabbed onto it." Act 2 is the part of this process in which you will keep your wits again. You will keep your wits about you, and you will begin grabbing onto the things that you need to succeed at the legislature. So let's run through this now. All right, so if you've stuck with me this long, you've gotten to the point where you're thinking that a legislative effort is right for you. This section describes my specific steps. And again, I'm coming at this whole thing from the viewpoint of a pure end member advocate without an activist bone in her body. Other people have different approaches. And I was a constant source of amusement and fascination to one staffer in particular, who I will not name, during the 2019 legislative session, who said, "It's just so interesting to see the differences between your approach and the approaches that others have tried." And I'm going to highlight some of them here because I think that's incredible. I'm bragging on my team, okay? I get that. But what we did, I think, was very successful, and we built upon some precedents that were set by professional lobbyists, actually. And I think that information is really valuable. And that, again, is why I'm making this homemade YouTube here. Okay, so we're going to go through a series of steps that you need to take in order to, launch your legislative effort. The first thing you need to do, step 1, is research. There's this very, very nondescript website called capital.texas.gov. And if you're in another state, then you've got a parallel website, for your legislature that's probably structured a lot like this. And when you first will open up that web page, it looks very plain, and it's like, okay, there's information on the House and the Senate, and there's some search and some committee information and all of that. But it's a government website, and it's not overly fancy. And so when I first looked at it, I didn't realize what a wealth of information is actually here. You can search every legislative session going back in time, and they're all on these pull down, drop down menus, and you can search words, phrases, and you can totally find, a wealth of information as to whether or not bills have been filed resembling yours, who the legislators are that filed them, what happened to those bills, did they pass in some form or did they fail? If they did fail, what stage of the process did they fail in? It goes on and on. This is an enormous cache of information here. And you're going to want, before you even approach a legislator and say, hey, would you be interested in, authoring this bill, you're going to want to research the Texas or your state's history on that exact topic so that you can speak from, a position of knowledge on that. So study it, summarize it for future reference, get it all down because it's important. You're also going to want to research what other states have done on the same issue. And this is more important than you might think because states look to each other's legislative precedents for an indication of, whether or not they want to do something similar. They kind of eyeball each other and say, well, they passed it over there, so obviously they didn't think it was such a radical idea. Maybe we ought to think about doing something similar over here. One of the greatest examples I've seen of citizen advocacy in this context was by a lady named Jan Sepich, and she too is a mother of a murdered daughter. Her daughter was murdered very violently and her body set on fire. And Jan became a big advocate for the use of DNA in solving crimes. And I had the good fortune of actually testifying. She was assigned to the same House committee hearing as me in 2019. So I actually heard her stand up as the mother of a murdered daughter and testify ahead of me. And after she got done, I felt about 2 inches tall because she knocked it out of the park. She just did an amazing job, persuasive, very riveting, interesting speaker. And I was like, dang, I can't do a job as well as she does. But what I didn't know at the time is that she had actually been doing that kind of advocacy for about a decade. In that House committee hearing, that was my first time testifying ever. She'd been doing it for a decade. So of course she was more polished. And so, that's, again, you want to look at what other states are doing, whether your, particular area is DNA evidence or some other thing altogether. Because it makes a very persuasive argument if you can go to a legislator and say, hey, Colorado has this, Texas doesn't have it. We need to get on board. This is a very reasonable idea and we need to make it happen. That's a very powerful argument if you can find out another state has already done something similar to what you want to do. Okay, after you've done your research, step 2, you're going to engage with a state representative or a senator. How do you do that? Well, darn, that's a good question. Many people find that to be very intimidating. And it could be your legislator, your state representative, your senator, depending on how it works out. And in my case, it actually was. I never intended that to happen because my representative had an interest in my bill topic. The connection was that I participated for a long time in a public service, a volunteer group that just happened to contain my state representative's wife. And so I knew her casually from there. In fact, our group had gone to the Texas Capitol to be, there was a resolution where we were honored for public service or whatever. And I had met him then. And so I had a phone number and reached out and said, hey, I have a legislative idea. Could we maybe meet for 30 minutes? Can I bounce it off of you? And so my legislation, House Bill 1769, was actually born on the corner of State Highway 3 and FM 518 in League City, Texas, in a Starbucks. It could be, however, another legislator who, as you do your research, you may stumble across one or more legislators who are particularly interested in your initiative and have already climbed that learning curve and already know something about it. And so maybe you want to talk to them first. It all depends on how it basically plays out. I've met advocates who actually got bills filed, believe it or not, because their state representative, somebody wanted to get elected, and what do candidates do? They go around knocking on doors. They go through neighborhood after neighborhood. And what is one of the questions that they commonly ask? They say, "Hi, I'm so and so. I'm running, I'm up for election to the Texas House, and I want to know, is there anything you think I should be focused on?" And at times, I've met people who said, "As a matter of fact, I did have an idea, blah, 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 one thing led to another," and the next thing you know, they actually have a bill filed. So, hey, there you have your political system working the way it ought to work. But anyway, the bottom line, though, is it may not be your representative or senator. It could be someone who's interested because they've had previous exposure to the issue. Once you've identified who you want to talk to, whether it is your representative or, and by the way, to find your representative, all you need to do is type in Google if you're in Texas, and I would hope this works in other states, but I'm not sure. Type in Google "who represents me," and it'll bring you directly to capital.texas.gov, and you can put your address in, and it will pop up with all of your representatives, state, federal, the whole slate. Anyway, after you've identified that person, whether it is your representative or senator or another one with an interest in the bill, just go ahead and ask for a brief meeting. Say, can we meet over coffee just for a few seconds, or can I come to your office? If the legislature is in session in Texas, they spend most of their time in Austin for that 140 days. So my personal preference is always to go in person. You might want to talk to them on the phone, but in an in-person meeting always has, carries a heavier weight as far as I'm concerned. Now, if you are working with a special interest group, they may have a very different approach to that. But that's the approach that I used. It's the good old, "Hey, can we meet for a few minutes at Starbucks?" Okay, so let's say that you have been successful. You had your Starbucks meeting or your meeting at the Texas Capitol, and your representative that you've managed to meet up with is willing to actually write a bill. So this is incredibly exciting. Some people find this dry, kind of nuts and bolts of legalese or whatever. I absolutely loved it. This process is actually how we build our society. Bit by bit, block by block. And so I found the whole process from start to finish absolutely fascinating. However, it is also complicated. So you need to learn the legislative process very well. And once again, when I started trying to do this in 2019 as a citizen advocate, the problem I ran into was too much bias. I would Google, I'd get a bunch of hits, but it was all special interest stuff. It was highly politicized. Most of it, I'd say 95% of what I read was written from the headspace of what? An activist rather than an advocate. Many people actually start their political involvement as activists simply because they don't know that there's another option. And I've seen it. I've seen, wheels turning in people's heads where they'll spend a few years or whatever trying it from that perspective, but then they realize this isn't getting me what I feel I need in the way of progress. And so they start reaching out and exploring, and then they discover the world of advocacy. One reference that I liked more than any other, you see where that says "you are here" up there? That one chart summarizes the mechanical process of legislation in Texas better than any other reference I've ever found. There are different graphics that people have made, but this one was produced by the University of Texas, And from start to finish through the House, you can see it going down the House, process, and then it whips back up and goes through the Senate process, then down through enrollment to the governor and final passage. That's the simplest, most direct way that I've ever seen it presented. Another useful reference that I stumbled on relatively late in the game, unfortunately, was called the Texas Advocacy Playbook. And you'll notice it says Texas Advocacy Playbook. It does not say Texas Activist Playbook. Published by the League of Women Voters of all sources. I mean, who knew? I didn't. But that book there contains a lot of really good information on how to get work done. And so those are two good references there that you may want to look at. There's also a little booklet that is available for about $10. In the gift shop, there's two gift shops at the Texas Capitol. One is in the annex to the Capitol building itself, kind of the underground portion there where there's a lot of legislative offices. And then the other one is in an historic building that's kind of at the edge of the Capitol grounds to the east. This thing is really good because it boils down all the information on legislators, but also their staffers, which is incredibly important. And this is something that unfortunately I find activists in particular don't always give staffers, legislative staffers, the respect that I think they're due. There are relatively few legislators, state representatives and senators at the Texas Capitol, and there are many, many staffers. And they all serve a limited number of minds, and staffers can actually get you more help than you might first think. They're there for a reason. Some of them are legislative analysts, where their whole job is to evaluate the hidden impacts, the pros, the cons, the everything surrounding legislation. That was one of the things I was most impressed at in 2019 when I was pursuing the Clear Alert was how much incredible care legislative analysts took in analyzing what could be the possible, unforeseen circumstances. For every action, there's an equal and opposite reaction. What are the unintended consequences of any given legislative proposal? These people put a lot of work into that stuff, and they're good to know. And so this little book for $10 actually lists staffers as well as legislators, and that's why it'll save you far more money than you'd ever spend on it, although it is not a free resource. There are some sites on the internet too where you can look up not just your legislators, but who actually works for them, because you're going to want to know who those people are. You're going to want to know their names and phone numbers. Okay, so here we have to interject a little bit of the courage characteristic of a leader. Okay, so let's recap. I'm on you can see where I'm on number 3B here. So by this time, you've determined that a legislative effort can solve or can at least address the issue of your concern. You've decided that you're either going to lead or you're working with someone. You've done your research to figure out how the legislative process works. You've talked to your legislator, and your legislator has agreed to author a bill for you. Now you're learning the legislative process so that you'll know what to expect as the bill moves through each stage. Guess what else you can do? And this is where we circle back to what I was talking about when I said, in my case, I formed informal partnerships with some nonprofits because that's what worked. That's what was the best fit for the legislation that I was pursuing, which was the Clear Alert, Emergency Broadcast Alert for Missing Adults. And why do I say you need courage to do that? Because it's going to require you to approach a lot of new people. And if you're a citizen advocate and you have a job and you're fitting this into your spare time, you have to understand that you're an unproven commodity. And there's going to be a lot of people out there who don't take you seriously at first. You're going to be approaching nonprofits that are within the general area of your legislative concern, And you're going to be saying, hey, can we sit down for a few minutes? I got a legislative idea. I actually got a bill author who's authoring a bill. And I'm wondering if we can amplify. Can we collaborate a little bit here? And a lot of people are just going to not open that door for you. They're just going to say, yeah, you guys are a dime a dozen. We've seen your type before and it didn't amount to much. But you just have to, again, this is where being a little bit disagreeable, I'm not saying impolite, I'm saying don't take no for an answer, push politely, and you might get somewhere. Victims advocacy groups, if you've got one in your area, can help with this, but they're very rare. Again, in Houston, here in Houston, Texas, we have Crime Stoppers of Houston, which is not just a tip line. It offers victim advocacy services, victim support services, and so Crime Stoppers helped me quite a bit. But you also have to realize that sometimes doors just won't open, and I had that experience with my legislation where I was like, okay, here's an organization, a nonprofit, a little nonprofit. They're a perfect fit for this initiative. I can amplify them, they can amplify me, everybody goes home happy. We get the legislation, pushed along maybe through this collaboration, and they just wouldn't bite. And so you also have to know, even though you have to push politely, you also have to know when to cut your losses as well. It's just the reality of it. People have their own, responsibilities and priorities. Okay, now we're on part 3C. We've talked about all of this process, and we're down to the point where, okay, you're talking to legislators. We're going to get to that. You're talking to possible team members, collaborators, such as nonprofits who are working in the service area, which is, interesting to you or aligned with your legislation. You're going to need some kind of calling cards, basically. You're going to need some materials so that you can leave them with people, summarizing, showing them where you're at or where you're coming from or whatever. The basics, some kind of a business card. This is an example of the business, little business card that I just created using, free clip art and, Microsoft Office products and some very basic stuff. You can get a package of the business cards you snap apart. That you feed through your printer. I don't know, they're like $20 or something. They're not expensive. But it still makes for a nice presentation. And as soon as you present that, people know, hey, this person has put some effort into it. They're actually serious. And here's their information. This is who they are. You may want to have a logo or a motif. I use free clip art to create that image. And part of my motivation was that, a rose was my daughter's favorite flower. Your one pager. We're going to talk about one pagers coming up next. And the bill authors, the legislators' one pager. Those two things are different and very different. And we're going to talk about that. You may, depending on your legislative initiative, want to create what's called a FAQ page, a frequently asked questions. As you're going around talking to nonprofits who are potential supporters and talking to legislators as you're lobbying for the passage of your legislative bill that's been filed, you may get the same questions over and over again, and you may want to summarize them and put them on a piece of paper. I did that for the Clear Alert. And, when you get questions, it really helps to have that handy so that you can just, you can just rattle off the answers really quickly and everyone's like, oh, okay, I see how you've addressed that potential concern. Anything that you need to demonstrate the reason, behind your legislative bill is also a good idea. I've worked with one advocate who is pursuing legislation for kidnapped children. So, of course, everybody likes to look at, everybody loves to look at pictures of children. So she travels with a little photo album where she can show her journey in pictures. And that's a wonderful icebreaker, that kind of thing. When you're talking to new people, is like, can I show you some of what I've been doing? People will warm up quickly to that kind of idea. And then maybe you would, maybe you'd want to develop a possible trinket or a tchotchke, but bear in mind that you can't give monetary gifts to legislators. It's against the lobbying rules, and they won't accept them. So the two pieces of art that you see here are actually, we made, my husband actually made us a challenge coin. Not, he didn't get it done until long after the legislative session. And that's the art that's on the front and back of our coin. On a more involved level, some advocates begin a charity or a foundation, and because it's appropriate for them in their context. But you should know that if you're wanting to do this kind of advocacy, you don't necessarily have to do that. It's not a requirement of any kind. Okay, now we're going to talk about one-pagers. I've been looking forward to this part. This is an example of a legislator's one-pager, and you can see that it contains 3 sections: background of the bill, bill summary, and then this happens to be a committee sub where our bill language got changed a little, which is very common. The bill gets filed, and then a bunch of people weigh in on it, including internal and external legislative analysts, and they say, no, I don't like that part, I think you should change this wording or strike that paragraph or add this paragraph or whatever. So a substitution gets written. And so this legislative one-pager basically describes in very dry, business-like, factual terms what that bill is all about. And this is a standard type of thing that is produced by legislators as they're, in the process of explaining their bills to other legislators who are going to vote on them. So again, it's basic information. Very often it'll have a staff or contact number or something on there so that if anyone has any questions, they can go directly to that staffer without having to mess around and say, hey, who's responsible for this one? And I mentioned about the substitution updates. But the bottom line on this is you can immediately see that this instrument is very businesslike, it's very standard, and it's intended to inform. It's not really intended to persuade. And the big difference between the bill author's one-pager and the one-pager that I strongly encourage you to create can immediately be seen when I show you mine, which is what I'm going to do now. There's my pride and joy right there. That is the personal one-pager that I created in order to go around and have something to show to both special interest groups that I was trying to get on board with my legislation and to other legislators to explain that to them and their staffers. And the best approach, you may wonder, is like, okay, these two things, they look really different. How did you come up, what made you decide to do this? And the answer is that I basically said, again, staffers can be very valuable to you. I went to the staffer who was, basically handling traffic on my House bill, and I said, what do lobbyists use? What do advocates use? How is it done? What does a one-pager look like when it's produced by somebody other than a bill author? Because there's more than one kind. And so she started digging around from previous legislative sessions and finding copies of one-pagers that other advocates and other lobbyists had handed to her and to their staff. And she said, well, here's an example and here's an example. So basically what I did was I took what I consider to be the best ideas off of a lot of the different one-pagers produced by others. And the number one source of my inspiration was actually some one-pagers produced by large oil companies that were, they have paid lobbyists that make fabulous amounts of money. The top 10, I think I read an article recently, the top 10 paid lobbyists in the state of Texas all make between $3 and $8 million a session. I think, it's something incredible. So this is an example of a one-pager created by someone who wasn't paid a dime. And in fact, I spent my own money to make this happen. But you see here, it's broken down into problem, solution, supporters. It's like bing, bang, bong. There it is. You have to remember that many legislators you talk to are going to have such limited time, because there are, if from the first presentation I did, if you remember, there were over 7,000 bills filed in Texas during my initial legislative session in 2019. You have to make an impression fast on a lot of these people. Otherwise, what's going to happen is that they're going to smile and nod, and they're going to do their best job at paying attention to you. But the fact of the matter is 50 other people also pitched bills to them that same day before you even got there. And if you don't make something that stands out, you're not going to be remembered. So I spent a bare minimum of, I would say, 100 hours building this one pager. It went through something like 16 different revisions. And one of the reasons why is that I had to get two types of permissions in order to create this list of supporters that you see here on the bottom, which of course is the immediate eye-catching portion of it. I had to go and develop relationships with each one of those other nonprofits individually, one at a time. And then I had to, after I got done explaining the bill and they said, that's a great idea, I had to ask them, okay, are you okay with me using your name and or your branding as I'm lobbying for this thing? And that's not as easy as you might think, because each one of these is a 501c3, and I think they're all 501c3s, a nonprofit corporation. There are strict rules in place on how involved such organizations can get with legislation. And so you can't just take somebody's, logo and slap it on your paperwork and call it a done deal. One of these organizations had to go to their attorney and say, listen, is it okay if this woman puts our logo on her one pager? Another one actually had to call their board of directors together and vote on it. And it had to be a majority vote. Yes, we can support this. Yet another one, I basically, I won't name names, but if you're in Texas, you might be able to guess who this was. I called them up and said, can I have your support? Can I list you as a supporter as I'm lobbying and advocating for this bill? And I got back a stream of expletives. And as the CEO said, gosh darn it, I've been telling them they need that legislation for years. Of course you can use my logo. So that was an interesting conversation. This is the kind of thing that you're going to want to show the news media. It's something you're going to want to put on social media. And again, you're distributing a piece of information that has other people's artwork, other people's branding on it. You must have their permission. You will notice at the bottom of this, I list a number of additional supporters by name, but there's no logo. Some of those are law enforcement entities, and you cannot, by the laws of the state of Texas, reproduce law enforcement branding, because there's a law against doing that, because people could be confused and they could mistakenly believe that they're looking at a publication that came from their law enforcement agency, and so there can't be anything confusing about that. This is also something that when you testify in the House and Senate, you're going to want to pass it to the members of that committee. And once you do, it becomes a part of the permanent record of that committee hearing. So again, big effort here, lot of work, lot of hard work, not the kind of flashy, work that gets a lot of public attention, mostly nose to the grindstone type stuff here in order to work out all of those permissions. I'm not kidding. I'm going to say it again. In some cases, here's an example of an email where I was given written permission to use the logo as it was displayed on, and this is actually not on my one pager, but later on I produced a a trifold, a simple brochure for use in public outreach on the Clear Alert. And so I had, wanted to use, somebody else paid for that because I won an award. And so I wanted to acknowledge them as the person, the organization that gave me the money that allowed me to do large scale printing of that piece of literature. And so you'll notice that it says you are permitted to utilize our logo as it's displayed on the material, not on as it's displayed on any other material. Similarly, of course, I had, this was a wonderful moment for me as an individual constituent when I got this text message from, a gentleman who was with the Sheriff's Association of Texas, and they were totally on board with my legislation, and it was thrilling, to be a nobody and to be able to, start a legislative effort and attract attention from a group of that caliber was just mind-blowing to me. But again, I was not able to use anything resembling their logo or imagery because it could cause confusion with a law enforcement agency versus some other effort. The advocacy community runs on trust and respect. Again, you have to be very respectful and humble if you're gonna succeed on this level. Here's the next thing you need to develop along with your business card and your one-pager and your fact page and all of that stuff. You've probably heard the expression elevator speech. And what that means is, picture yourself and you're riding between the ground floor and the fourth floor or whatever with someone in the elevator, and you only have like a very short period of time to make an impact on that person. How do you boil down your message and deliver it in a way that gets your point across effectively? Well, if you take that idea of the elevator speech to the next level, you develop what I call a lightning rod statement. And that I call it that. There's no formal name for what I'm talking about here that I know of, but I call it that because it's that one statement that electrifies people. And this was mine. This is a screenshot from the live stream in the Texas Senate. And I'm sitting next to my senator here, Senator Larry Taylor, and I'm testifying is what you see in the screen grab. And my lightning rod statement with respect to my daughter was, she was 14 months too old to be considered for an Amber Alert. And when people heard that, they were like, what? Whoa. You know what? I never thought of it like that before. You mean to tell me that we can call an Amber Alert for a 17-year-old, but if an 18-year-old or a 19-year-old goes missing under the same circumstances, we can't? Are you serious? I never even thought of it that way, but you're right. We need this legislation. And my lightning rod statement was successful in this manner. You have to remember that as you're trying to persuade someone of your position, if you lead them to drawing their own conclusions, that's what's going to stick with them. That's always going to be stronger than any degree of persuasion or any degree of convincing that you can muster is going to pale in comparison to them drawing their own conclusions. So as soon as I said something like that, then people were like, okay, we need this legislation. No need to discuss it further because that's crazy. That your daughter, an alert couldn't be called for her because she was a teenager, but she was just a little bit too old. That's just wrong. Okay, as you are getting back to the outreach materials that you're going to need when talking to legislators, nonprofit organizations who might be teaming partners and all of that, develop a social media presence. This was a tough one for me because I'm not a big social media fan, but Twitter, Facebook at a minimum, use some colorful imagery. The roses were my daughter's favorite flower, and the images you see here were actually from her memorial service, and we had an enormous bouquet of roses for her. Focus on the legislation. This is something that drives me bananas about. Some people get into activism and maybe they get a following, and all of a sudden they start running off on social media about every possible topic that's got nothing to do with their objective, and it's very, very disorienting to those people who are just happen to be browsing through, and they're like, okay, what's this person up to? And then there's all this stuff about something that happened 3 states over that's got nothing to do with their legislation. And you got to wonder why they would choose to do that, because it loses focus. Use every opportunity to generate, unique content, warm content, colorful, not adversarial. Again, you want to cultivate on social media as well. You want to be cultivating cooperation and collaboration, and you want to be avoiding confrontation if you're going to be, maximally effective at this kind of stuff. This is an image again where I just posted up pictures of our state representatives who signed on as joint authors to the Clear Alert, and everybody loved it. It's like, oh look, a bunch of smiling people. What could be wrong with that? Contact the news media to generate interest. If you have a catalyst case, then the news media may be interested in what you say about legislation. Much like legislators, the news media people are very conscious of the fact that citizen advocates have a hard time with legislative participation because they have other responsibilities and they're not supported. And so they're very interested in those. Are very big human interest stories, and the media is often quick to jump on top of it. Special interest groups may be able to help. The media is in and out of, I've raised the example of, my partner, I don't know what you call him. I've done a lot of work with Crime Stoppers of Houston. We collaborate. And so the media is at Crime Stoppers almost every day of the week, Crime Stoppers of Houston anyway. And so I actually did one of my media interviews from that location to make it easier on the film crew, because they were going to be there for other reasons. And we sort of killed 2 birds with 1 stone. Manage the media's expectations. These are people trying to do their jobs. As you're working with them, if there's anything that's off limits you don't want to talk about in their interview, if you have a pending trial, if you're a violent crime victim or your loved one's been murdered or whatever, you can't talk about that stuff on television. So politely let them know, what you do and what you can and cannot talk about. Take time to generate relationships with the media if you can. And here's a great example. This is Dr. Maggie Zingman. And once again, as you can tell, I met a lot of mothers of murdered children, and I networked with them because they all had something incredibly important to teach me when I was going through this process. And Dr. Zingman as well is a DNA evidence advocate, and her daughter's murder remains unsolved to this day, almost 20 years after it happened. And so she developed an angle that was very, very unique, where she had her vehicle wrapped in very bright colors, and she drives from place to place, catching the ear of various media organizations so that she can discuss, the importance of having laws that allow the collection of DNA and the use of DNA in solving crimes. Wonderful woman. Okay, so that is the end of Act 2. So it's time to take another breath, hit pause on YouTube if you need to, and we will continue with Act 3. Okay, thank you for coming back. Welcome to Act 3, which I call It's Go Time. At this point in our Harold and the Purple Crayon story, Harold is really cooking with gas. And the pages from the book that I'm showing read, he made lots of buildings full of windows. He made a whole city full of windows. So Harold is zeroing in on his objective at this point in our parallel story, and so are we. So here we go. Once you've got your bill and it begins moving through the legislative session in Texas, things can begin to happen very quickly. Usually what happens is that a bill will go through the House of Representatives first, in which case The only pathway for that to happen is through a committee of some kind, which will hold a public hearing on the bill. And this is an extremely important part of the legislative process that a lot of folks don't necessarily understand when they start this effort. If you listen to media reports, sometimes it seems like the important thing is to actually show up, shake politicians' hands, talk up your bill, all of that. Not so. All of those things, of course, are valuable, but those are activities taking place behind the scenes. What happens on the record is what's reflected in that committee hearing, and that's where you really need to shine. In Texas, we have multiple committees at the House level and the Senate, but they don't exactly align, so that makes for an interesting situation in which your bill, like mine, may get assigned to committees that don't really seem to bear any resemblance to each other. It's kind of a curious thing. So House Bill 1769, which was the Clear Alert legislation, first went through Homeland Security and Public Safety in the House of Representatives, and that's because it was an emergency broadcast alert that was going to be administered, if it passed, primarily by the Texas Department of Public Safety. However, once it got to the Senate, they don't have, that body, legislative body doesn't have anything like a Homeland Security Committee. What they had instead was transportation. And the reason it went through there is because our emergency broadcast alert system uses what's called dynamic messaging, system signs, DMS signs. And so Texas Department of Transportation administers those signs. So this was going to be impacting that government agency, and that's why it was chosen for inclusion in the Senate Transportation Committee. It's kind of curious. Once you have been assigned to committee, your bill has been assigned to committee, that's when you're going to really want to focus on a specific set of legislators. So rather than just promoting and lobbying for your bill generally, you're actually going to focus on just those people and their staffers, because staffers are really important and helpful. When you get into this, you want to be, again, respectful, attitude of humility, get with the program, work the system, don't work against the system. Be brief. Remember how many bills they have to deal with. You're going to be the 50th person they see on any given day, and you have to respect their time. Be polished. Be ready to discuss your bill. Hand your one-pager, your bill author's one-pager, and say, hey, I'm available to answer any questions on this bill. I'm the citizen advocate who asked for the bill to be filed, and I am going around asking people if they need to know anything, if I can be any help. Be systematic. Don't just run willy-nilly through the Capitol and, there's a door, I think I'll knock on that one. A better approach is to actually set up some kind of a spreadsheet or a tracking system. What I used on my first go-around in 2019 was this kind of thing where I would make notes on first contact in purple on business cards that I picked up in my legislators' offices. And then I would make notes on second contact in red, and I chose those two colors, and they correspond to the colors of this presentation because they were my daughter's favorite colors, pink and purple, actually. She was a very feminine young lady. By the time I got to the 2021 session, I was using spreadsheets instead of this method, but whatever method you use, it's a good idea to be able to track which legislators you've talked to and which you haven't met yet. And that way you don't confuse yourself or waste people's time. And follow up with thank yous, of course. People really like hearing thank yous. And you get your name in front of them, of course, once again, if you follow up for any reason, including saying thank you. Never hurts. All right, you're going to hear, you've heard me harp about this already, and I got to do it again because that's the way I am. Constantly be reminding yourself, if you're doing this in Texas, that what you see on television and what you hear in the media are not necessarily the true reality of life as an advocate. Austin, Texas is not Washington, D.C. The degree of polarization and politicization in Washington blows my mind. Television and Twitter are not real life. You're going to see mostly activism in both of those places. Advocates tend not to make the news. We work behind the scenes and we work hard. But it's not flashy stuff and it doesn't get publicized as much. Advocates are not activists. I've said it again. I've said it too many times probably, but it's really important. The act of legislating is an awesome responsibility. You know, when you go and you help to create new laws, you are changing the course of our society in some small but meaningful way. Nobody understands at the outcome what the unintended effects of that kind of activity might be. And so, you know, it's very important to be humble in all of this and realize the magnitude of what you're doing. And you know, what could happen in the way of unintended consequences. So again, I'm sorry, I have to do it. Texas has 30 million people, $250 billion budget, 140 days of legislative regular session every second year. Contrary to popular mythology, our representatives, senators and state representatives, they don't make a lot of money. $7,200 plus living allowance, $7,200 per year. This isn't a bunch of, you know, you hear about political fat cats on television. It doesn't really work that way in reality. These are people who are mostly there because they're trying to make a difference in their own way through the, you know, process of getting elected and trying to represent their constituents as best they can. There's a lot of humble people at the Texas legislature. I know you don't see that on TV, but when you go in person and you do the work, you might be surprised. The outcome, the upshot of everything I just said, the Capitol is frantic, but it is respectful, and people do not mess around. You know, get with the program, do things professionally if you're going to be an advocate. Become a cog, not an obstruction. And I'm going to beat the dead horse again. Sorry, guys. This is advocacy, okay? That's an example again of my one-pager. This is advocacy. This is not. This is activism. Don't mix the two of them up because you'll discredit yourself if you do. Each one has their own role. Each of those roles is vital, but they can't really do each other's jobs. Become a cog, not an obstruction. You have to take the difference seriously. All right, step 5 in our process. Believe me, we're getting to the end. It's not too much further. The House Committee hearing. Once again, it is typically the largest and most significant hurdle. Well, I don't know if it's largest is the right way to say it, but it's typically the first. And bills normally in Texas move through the House first and then proceed to the Senate according to that very elaborate flow diagram that I showed. There's often very little advance notice in Texas. Typically, when the bills get assigned to committee, there's maybe 72 hours at best. And so if you are going to testify on your bill, as you should, if you're going to line up additional testifiers, you're going to have very, very little time. People have to be aware in advance, okay, this is coming. I got to make sure I'm ready for it. And it's hard, okay, because many of us will, you know, if we're going to go to the legislature to testify in a legislative committee hearing, we have to take time off work. We have to travel to the Capitol. We have to, you know, these committee hearings start at 8:30 in the morning. If you're traveling hundreds of miles, you're going to have to go up the night before. So there's going to be expenses. It's something that you need to think through. I recommend that you line up 3 testifiers, and of course your legislator is going to be assisting you with this process and their staffers. Plus have at least one additional an alternate person in the room so that they can take the place of a testifier in case someone gets stuck in traffic or has a family illness or emergency or whatever, and they just can't make it. That way you're covered, right? Credible testifiers can make or break the hearing. Again, one of the mistakes that I see citizens make, individual constituents trying to advocate for legislation, mistake that I see them make is they think, well, I've already, I've shaken the hands of so many legislators. I've talked to everybody. I think I've got it covered. I don't really need to show up. I've done my job. You've done your job if your job is an activist, but you haven't done your job if your job is that of an advocate. Credible testifiers can make or break the hearing. That is the part that goes on the record and lives for all eternity on that website I showed you, which is capitol.texas.gov. And I'll show you as we're going through the next set of slides what I mean by that, because information given in a public hearing, in a legislative hearing, becomes part of the permanent record of your bill. In Texas, because we have such a short legislative session and such a huge, diverse population, there's very often more people who want to testify than really there's time for because of the scheduling concerns. And so there's what's called House witness registration, which is what happens when people show up and they want to be on the record as being in favor of a bill, but they don't necessarily want to testify, or according to the, how you've set up your intended plan of action for committee testimony, there's not really room for them. And I hate to say it that way, because in Texas, if you want anyone who wants to testify in front of a legislative committee has the right to do so. But if you're a Texan, you know that there are 30 million of us. There's a lot. And all we do half the time is stand in lines of one kind or another, because access to many different things is tight. So I encourage supporters, of course, and you should too, encourage your supporters to show up for you, but they may want to register rather than testifying. And testifying orally, and I'm going to show you why in just a second here. Okay, I said a minute ago that if your supporters show up and register but not testify, they're going to end up on this permanent list, which is a report generated for that committee hearing. And this is an example of mine. So what we're going to do is we're just going to take a moment here to absorb what's on this piece of paper, because when you go to capitol.texas.gov and you click onto the various tabs for the bill, when you're looking it up, you're going to find this list and many other resources, but this one is important. So basically you see the date and the time at the top there, and then it goes, you see the word for, and then there's 3 names, and then there's another word on. We'll ignore that for the time being. And then you'll see an underlined phrase, registering but not testifying. And what that is the list of everybody who actually showed up to register a position on the bill, again, through those computer monitors that are available only in the Texas Capitol. You can't do this on the internet. You have to do it right there in the Capitol. Requires people to show up. This is a list of all of the people who wanted to have their positions known formally on a bill, but who didn't really need to testify, because the first 3 covered the job, right? So here's another view of the same piece of paper. We need to be brief and respectful when we do committee testimony, because there's a lot of other people, who also want a chance. They want access. So here's the same piece of paper again. Once again, you'll see at the top 3 testifiers, very brief, just a couple of minutes apiece. No need to beat a dead horse. And then all of these supporters down here. Imagine what would have happened if all of these people had also signed up to deliver, verbal testimony saying, I support this bill because, and this is how it fits with our organization, yada, yada. Nobody else in the Texas Capitol who was assigned to the same committee hearing would ever have a chance. They wouldn't be able to do anything, right? And so this is how we balance it. And it's good to remember too that if you are the committee hearing isn't the end of the game by any means. So let's say that you were one of these people who were in here and you want to keep advocating for that bill. You could later go to one of those or more than one of those committee members and say, hey, I was in that committee hearing and I registered, but I didn't testify at that time, but I'd like an opportunity to talk to you now after the fact because I heard something and I'm unclear and I want to discuss that with you. So this isn't the end of the game. And if you are one of those people who decides to register but not testify in the state of Texas on a legislative bill, understand that it is extremely important to make a showing as strong as what's represented here, but it's not the end of the game by any means. You can go to legislators after the fact, and in some cases it might actually be more effective in terms of lobbying. Okay, so once you get out of, assuming your bill doesn't die in committee, which many of them do, if you proceed beyond committee, you go into something called calendars, and your legislator will be heavily involved at this point. There's a couple of different pathways that a bill can travel through calendars, but that's where it gets scheduled for a vote, basically. Next step, of course, if you're following the House First pathway, and this is the same slide that I showed in my initial presentation, the blurry one, because it was such an emotional event for me, and I couldn't hold the camera steady to take a decent picture of my own bill up on the board there. Typically, the first vote is in the House. It may happen lickety split, lightning fast. You could blink and you could miss it, as Ferris Bueller, I think it was, used to say. It's still nice to be there for that moment, and I'm very glad that I was, but it doesn't take long because, again, they're putting through a lot of bills. Okay, so let's say you've proceeded to this point in the process. You've gone through host committee. You've done a bang-up job, and you've done a really good presentation in committee. The committee voted favorably. Your bill advanced to the House of Representatives. It was voted on, and the vote was in the affirmative. Your bill passed the House, essentially. You next need to move through the very, very similar process in the Senate. And again, I'm talking about Texas here, but many other states are set up with kind of a parallel system. You need to get a Senate sponsor at some point in this process. It's not good enough to just have a House of Representatives sponsor if that's how you, or bill author rather, if that's how you've started out. So sometimes people already have Senate sponsors before they ever get out of the House. In many cases, though, they don't, because so many bills in Texas die in committee, or maybe they don't even make it to committee, that it's often, why even bother trying to get a Senate sponsor when you don't even know if you're going to get past the first hurdle? But once you've been voted favorably out of the House of Representatives, then yeah, somebody's got to step forward as your Senate sponsor. And then once again, this is a blow up of that part of the, from the University of Texas, that chart that shows the Senate process. It's very similar to the House, and oftentimes it will move faster because the House of Representatives has already vetted the bill, and so the Senate is doing a double check, and that is part of our legislative process, but they don't necessarily need to go over it with a fine-tooth comb unless it's controversial or something, and so it could be much faster. I like to think of the Texas Senate as a superconducting hive mind. We have about 150 state representatives as of this session, but only 31 senators. So it's very easy for the staffers in the Senate to be in constant mutual communication and to know where they all stand. The House of Representatives tends to be like a hot mess, but the Senate is very, very organized. And in the video I showed in my first presentation at Crime Stoppers, I played the 3-minute video of what it took to get House Bill 1769 passed in the Senate. And it's like, whoa, what just happened? It happened so fast. And that's because, again, they're putting through such a volume of work. And then the final step, of course, is that your bill goes on to the governor for signature. If you get voted successfully in the House and the Senate, governor's the next step on that in that lineup. And sometimes there may be a situation where, there's a process. If the bill is controversial, the governor does have certain veto rights. But for for simple bills like what mine was, we didn't have any worries that, we had a near unanimous process in the House and the Senate. And so we weren't necessarily worried about the governor having any objections to the bill. And in fact, it went through quite smoothly. And we did have a little ceremonial bill signing event. So that was cool too. Recap. I call this presentation Legislative Strategies 101, and coincidentally, my House Bill 1769 took 101 days to work its way through all of that process: the House, the committee, the Senate committee, and the governor. So that is the end of Act 3. Harold is finally home in our parallel story. He's got his purple crayon, he made his bed, he got in it, and he drew up the covers. Recommendations and recap again. Verify that your legislative idea is actually legislation worthy, and that it wouldn't be better, handled through a social mechanism or some personal change in your life. Don't assume it's legislation worthy. And even once you get the idea and you think it's legislation worthy, make sure you do your research to verify that, it's not already out there, or some version of it, didn't already happen or something like that. Know what you're getting into. Know the personal factors, which I covered in the first presentation. And then also know, all the work you're going to have to do. Know the difference between advocacy and activism. Get familiar with the entire process and the research and the whole 9 yards, because you're going to need it. Work hard. Be thorough. Work smart by protocol. It's all about relationships. I can't tell you how many times I heard that in 2019 when I went through the legislative session. It's all about relationships. It's all about building trust. And that is so different than anything you're going to see on the television when it's all this high stakes game of political infighting and all of that stuff. The best way to succeed in Texas politics is to not be political. And I suspect strongly that the same thing holds true in other jurisdictions and other states as well. Because how could it be any different? I mean, at some point, we got to, let go of the political grandstanding that we see on television and actually get down to work and cooperate if anything good is going to come out of all of our efforts. There are no shortcuts. It took me 100 hours to create my one-pager and to get those permissions and to line up those supporters and to lay it all out like that. There is no substitute for hard work. Never was, never will be. This is the list of people I put together right here, and it's massive, to thank, that I published in thanks for all of the help. There's actually over 300 people listed here, and these are just the people that, agreed to have their, didn't have any objection to having their names on my thank you list. I mentioned in my first talk that the real secret to this, in being an individual constituent and soliciting support and participation from related stakeholders, is you've got to get a little bit of help from a lot of people, because each one of these people on this list, some of them only did 15 minutes of work, but every one of them had to drop everything that they were doing at some point and focus their attention exclusively on House Bill 1769 to do their part. And when you take all of those efforts like that, and you weave them together into a whole, and by you, I mean you, the leader, and whoever you're working with in the leadership capacity, once you weave them together, if you do it skillfully, and respectfully, it can make for one heck of an effort. If you have any questions, please reach out to me. And by the way, these are little scanned, all of these, I sent a lot of thank you cards. So these are all scanned portions of various thank you cards that I sent out to folks. Sometimes the old-fashioned methods work really well. People respond extremely well to expressions of gratitude, especially when they're genuine. And if someone has helped you on a legislative effort, then of course you're going to be grateful and it's going to be real. So that's just a sampling of my thank you cards.